The John Lebang Show has been known to make people laugh, sing, think, scream, throw things in rage, and generally lose their minds. Listener discretion is advised.
Worldwide and out to the greater universe, you're listening to the John Lebang Show.
Greetings, Earthlings, and alert the media. Welcome back to another rock and roll unraveled version of the John Lebang Show. I'm your host, John Lebang, and joining me from across the pond is our good friend, author, drummer, and rock and roll historian, Mr. Derek Shelmerdine.
Hi, John. It's great to be talking to you again, mate.
I love having you on, my brother, and you've got some incredible stuff about psychedelia this month.
Oh, that's right. I thought it'd be.
Should we light up a joint or something before we get started? Since we're talking about psychedelia, and maybe drop some acid?
Well, never a bad thing. It's not something I really experimented with too much because there are too many demons.
Yeah, we don't want the show to go off the rails either.
No. I think we're probably it won't stray too far from the music. Although, if you look at why it's called psychedelic and how it all came about, it's really quite interesting. Because the term itself, psychedelic, was coined back in 1956. By a British psychologist called Humphrey Osmond. Now, he was a chum of Aldous Huxley, and in a letter to Aldous Huxley in 1956, he famously used the word psychedelic as a synonym for hallucinogenic drugs, and it sort of stuck and became a whole rock and roll medium. Aldous Huxley, of course, is the guy we've got to thank for the name of the band, The Doors, because of his book, The Doors of Perception. But Aldous Huxley actually nicked that from William Blake, a British poet and artist in the 19th century. He wrote a thing called the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And the actual quote in that started all the Doors thing, the quote is, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it truly is, infinite." Now, if that isn't a good start to a psychedelic conversation, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I'm about ready to light that joint up. Here, hold on. Let's. Okay, go ahead, Derek. We're buzzing now. Let's go.
Absolutely perfect. The whole psychedelic rock thing was only a very short period. I mean, it sort of started to come together in '65, and really by '68, it was pretty much all over. The hits were gone by the end of the 60s, and by the early 70s, the bands that were psych bands, they were all pretty much history as well. But the other thing that's interesting about it was the sort of dawning of the first age of teenage counterculture.
But that was all going on at the time anyways with the psychedelic music, and at least here in the States there were a lot of anti-government type things with the war and stuff, so it all sort of came together. It was a sort of perfect storm in a way. But what was becoming different about this, I mean, rock and roll really morphed into beat music, sort of garage type music, and then that morphed into rock. And psychedelic rock was really one of the first sort of side turnings that rock took. I mean, the concerts themselves had light shows, and they played movies in the background, particularly sort of silent movies with people like Charlie Chaplin, Laurel and Hardy. And the music itself looked to replicate the effects of the hallucinogenic experience. And there's an author I came across called Michael Hicks, who reckons there are three elements to psychedelic music. You've got dechronicization, which is to move outside the conventional perceptions of time, as in sort of chronomics. Depersonalization, where you lose the self
sort of gain awareness of an undifferentiated unity. What a great concept that is. And dynamization, and apparently Timothy Leary was quoted as saying, it makes everything seem to bend, familiar forms dissolve into moving, dancing structures. And I think that gives a good feel for what the whole psychedelic experience is about. But British and American psychedelia were really quite different. American psychedelic music was much more blues-based, but UK was more about whimsical lyrics and changes in time signature, special effects, a lot of use of keyboards and distorted guitars. I think one of the big differences is the less focused the American psych is on whimsy. I mean, if you look at people like the Pink Floyd, Syd Barrett, the first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, you look at the tracks on that and then, compare it with later Pink Floyd, you see a very, very different concept.
Yeah, but they still had that underlying mood. There was always some sort of psychedelic stuff underlying in their albums. Maybe not on particular songs, but they did a lot of crazy stuff on their albums, and I think that's where their roots began, was in that first album when they were doing psychedelia.
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely right. I mean, the use of swirling keyboards, distorted guitars, and time signature changes was something Floyd used. I mean, Zappa uses that a lot. But Floyd and another band, Soft Machine, when you pass the sort of classic psychedelic era, I mean, those bands are still going now, basically.
And the use of distorted guitars, that was really the first of its kind at the time, right?
Pretty much. I mean, you did have, famously, the guitarist, can't remember his name now, on the first ever rock and roll single, Rocket 88, Jackie Brenston. He famously used a slightly distorted guitar, but the real heavy-duty distortion came around this sort of period. Well, I mean, Hendrix was very much part of that, and his music's very much Purple Haze, particularly as an early single. Very much thought of as psychedelic.
The song "Are You Experienced" with all the backward stuff going on there. I mean, so yeah, I could see how he was one of the almost the forefathers of that in some ways.
Oh, very much so. Because I mean, he was one of the very front runners when it came to rock music, because he was sort of discovered by Chas Chandler over in Cafe War in New York, and I think it was around the sort of September, October was when Chas Chandler, the old Animals bass player, because the Animals had folded by then, they were on their final tour, which happened to be in America. Chas Chandler saw him, wanted to get into management, and brought him over to the UK. So I mean, he was really changing the face of guitar playing in mid-66. If you look at LSD itself, I mean, that goes back to 1938. A guy called Albert Hoffman was the first guy to synthesize LSD-25, lysergic acid diethylamide.
That's a tough word, isn't it?
There are a few words along the way that you really wouldn't want to be trying to pronounce after 2 or 3 pints or a couple of sugar lumps.
It's hard enough to pronounce when you're completely sober.
Oh, absolutely. I have to pause with 1 or 2 of them. But Ken Kesey was one of the front runners in all this. And in 1959, I mean, he was at college at Stanford, and he was working part-time at the Menlo Veterans Hospital nearby. And the CIA were funding an LSD experiment program at the hospital at that particular time to study the effects of psychoactive drugs. And a lot of that's in the background to his book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Which was a great book and movie. Oh, absolutely. I preferred the movie to the book, because in the book, the American Indian guy, the big fella, he was the narrator for the book, which didn't work quite like that in the film. Yeah, but in the film you also had Jack, and Jack makes any film better. Oh, absolutely. The famous Nurse Ratched. The first reference on record probably comes in 1960 with an LA band called the Gamblers. Now that Gamblers, the reason I said LA was not to be confused with the Belfast Gamblers that became Them with Van Morrison, and the Newcastle in Northern England's Gamblers, who became Billy Fury's last backing group. Billy Fury was very popular British rock and roll artist in the 50s and early 60s, well, up to the middle 60s. And they released in May 60 a single with Moondog on the A side and LSD 25 on the B side. I mean, they were both instrumentals. The band was driven very much by a guy called Derry Weaver. But if you look at the lineup for the band, I mean, it's got Elliot Ingber on guitar. He was one of the very original Mothers of Invention. He was part of Zappa's Mothers when they turned into the Mothers of Invention, left after the first album. Bruce Johnson on piano.
Beach Boys.
Became the Beach Boys, absolutely. Larry Taylor, the bass player, canned rock. I mean, who would have thought, listening in 1960 to the A-side Moondog, that those three guys would end up in very, very significant bands. I mean, it was actually classed as surf rock, though I don't think the term was in use at that particular time.
And that single, their B-side was an instrumental as well.
That's right.
Which laid into psychedelic music, because psychedelic music, a lot of that was instrumental.
That's right. That's right. Because it's really about feeling it. It's not really about, not so much about the lyrics in some ways. But a couple of these guys are on tour now. Larry Taylor is on tour with Canned Heat. And
what a name, Canned Heat.
But they're on tour in America, 28th of November to the 13th of January. And they're doing something called the Rock Legends Cruise out of Miami, 14th to the 18th of February. So if you're into cruises and you happen to be in the Miami area, or you fly in, I mean, that would be an awesome few days, I would think.
Definitely. Also, the Beach Boys are on tour.
That's right. I mean, Bruce Johnson, along with Mike Loves, licensed the name The Beach Boys from whoever actually owns it. And they're on tour, the Beach Boys, with Bruce Johnson, Canada, USA, St. Martin in the Caribbean, and they're coming over to the UK. And that's going on from the 8th of November through to the 25th of June.
Yeah, it's an extensive tour.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they've been on the road for quite a while. I mean, this tour doesn't start on the 8th of November. They have been touring for a while. And Brian Wilson, I think, is on tour at the moment. I seem to remember he's doing a Christmas special, if you're a big Beach Boys fan. So there's lots of opportunities to see these guys. But what I like about psychedelia is it's one of these mediums that pulls together two generations. You've got a lot of the references are going to come to people who were beat writers in the 1950s and poets, and they all sort of come together. The sort of whole hippie thing meets beatnik was very much what the psychedelic music was all about. And as early as '64, there was a sort of psychedelic blues stroke country band called the Holy Modal Rounders. I mean, that is a great name.
Definitely.
To conjure with. I mean, it was a duo that came together in sort of '63 in New York, Peter Stamplin and Steve Weber. But on their first album, again, a reference to psychedelia, there's a track called Hesitation Blues. The album was eponymously titled. Hesitation Blues. And the line in the song is, "My psychedelic feet in my psychedelic shoes," and then a bit more, "got the psychedelic blues." So there's lots of good early references.
And you're talking that it's kind of the amalgamation of the hippies and the beatniks. So psychedelic music was really the conduit to transform from the beatniks right to the hippies?
Absolutely. Once you start to look at some of the things that were happening, Allen Ginsberg pops up all over the place. I mean, the Holy Modal Rounders, they teamed up after the second album with Tuli Kupferberg and Ed Sanders, and they eventually became the Fugs. Now, Kupferberg's interesting because he pops up as a reference in Allen Ginsberg's The Howl. But just before we get to that, '64, Ken Casey and his Merry Pranksters, that was when they took their famous coach journey across America, and it was intended to be a movie. The movie itself it did transpire sort of decades later, but that was the whole thing that inspired Paul McCartney for the Magical Mystery Tour.
We're going to take a quick break, folks. When we return, we've got more with Mr. Derek Shelmerdine and psychedelic music right after this. Don't go anywhere now.
John will be right back right after this.
Yes, he will. Check out the new book from Derek Shelmerdine,
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
It tells the story of rock and roll from its roots right up until the mid-'70s punk.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Not just the music, but also the events that shaped the music.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
It includes the backgrounds to recording sessions, singles, album releases, births and deaths, epic concerts, and festivals.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Shelmerdine has made a painstaking effort to document pretty much every event that would prove significant in shaping popular music.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Purchase the book at www.rockandrollunraveled.com. Follow him at Twitter at R&R Unraveled, and look him up on Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
By author Derek Shelmerdine.
Available now.
I think of myself more as a song and dance man, you know.
The only reason that we are still together is that the subtlety of delicate change in the music.
Some of it's old, some of it's new, something borrowed, something brown.
Let's say you have a band that wears makeup, and you've got snakes, and you've got guillotines, and you've got really hard rock, Detroit rock and roll.
All those groups and people that started off when we were starting off, they're all still going.
It's funny how many times rock and roll's been dead. Yeah, how many times people have said it's been dead, it just keeps coming back like a bloody phoenix. Rock and roll!
I mean, Allen Ginsberg's popped up a few times. I mean, he famously did the first reading of Howl, his poem, in October 1955, and that was actually sued. The publishers were sued for obscenity in '57. But when the judge came to sort of to sentence him, as it were, the publisher, he very much took the side of the author and the publisher, and it was a guy called Judge Clayton Horn, and he quoted the motto of the English Order of the Garter, which is "Evil to him who evil thinks." And I thought that was great. You know, this is a good book. It's you that's got the bad mind.
And what did the publisher think was so obscene? Because they were suing him over it. So
I can't remember exactly what the bits were, but I mean I've read the poem. It's very much about drugs and desolation, and there are probably some references in there that people would take umbrage to.
Can you imagine the publishers and the people of that day jumping forward to today and seeing this? Because whatever was obscene back then is like normalized today. These people wouldn't know what to do.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that really shows the difference between then and now.
Lady Gaga would freak them out.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, quite rightly too. But one of these big in the UK coming together of beatniks and hippies was at the Albert Hall in a thing called the International Poetry Incarnation in '65, and that was one of the first real British happenings. But if you like, the sort of psychedelic music we all know and love, that's really starting to come together in the middle of 1965. The Charlatans, who were very much, they were a San Francisco band, but they got the first residency at the Red Dog Saloon in Virginia City, Nevada, and they became the first house band. A guy called Dan Hicks, who's not quite still around, but up until very recently, and his band, the Hot Licks, he was very much part of the early Charlatans, and the Red Dog Saloon itself was reckoned to be the first psychedelic dance hall. If it wasn't actually the first, it certainly was one of the earliest. And Big Brother and the Holding Company became the house band when the Charlatans moved on in '66. And the thing about Red Dog, you can't really say it's on tour, but you can actually go there if you happen to be in Virginia City. They have an open mic there on a Wednesday, starts at 7:30 according to their website, and they have live bands at the weekend, so you could actually become part of the psychedelic experience.
And that's what they do. They still continue the psychedelic experience there.
Yeah, I mean, they promote themselves very much. They promote their history very much. But nowadays, I mean, there'd be a whole host of different kinds of music playing there. But it's great to see that, you know, the Red Dog Saloon, something that was around in the mid-'60s and a major player as a venue in the story, is still going strong. I think that's great. So many venues from that era sadly no longer with us.
Now we got some early UK singles coming up, right?
Yeah, some great early British singles popping up. I mean, the Kinks, again, Summer 65, See My Friends, very much uses a sort of Indian raga sound, and that's part of the beginning of all this. Dave Davis is on tour. He's in America, 9th to the 21st of April. And the Cast-Off Kinks, which you couldn't really call them a tribute band because most of the people in it have been in the Kinks at one point or another. They're touring in the UK from the 8th of November to the 7th of December.
No, that's great.
And the Yardbirds.
That's in the UK, right? They're in the UK for that.
Yeah, the Cast-Off Kinks are just in the UK, and Dave Davis is just in America. And they're relatively short tours as well. I mean, Dave Davis is 9th to the 21st of April next year, and the Cast-Off Kinks is the 8th of November to the 7th of December. What I've noticed is an awful lot of the people we talk about are only on the road for quite a short time. I think it's because it's coming up to December. A lot of people like to finish their tours before Christmas.
That's because they have arthritis and stuff, and it'd be hard to tour in the winter time.
Absolutely.
I mean, none of these people we're talking about are young chickens anymore.
Yeah. Well, cannabis is supposed to be very good for arthritis, keep it in the context, as it were. But the Yardbirds, I mean, I've seen it referred to as the first psychedelic-sounding British pop song. They released Evil Hearted You in the UK towards the end of 65. But the whole acid thing really started to pick up towards the end of 65. On the 27th of November, Ken Casey and his Merry Pranksters held their first acid test event in Santa Cruz, and that's often referred to as the birth of psychedelic rock. And apparently what they had there was spiked orange juice called electric Kool-Aid.
I'll keep the joke to myself.
That's got to be a refreshing kind of drink. And the Warlocks were playing in that particular one. They were regular performers. Ken Casey ran a lot of these acid events across the next couple of years, and they were still the Warlocks when they played this first one. It was just before they changed their name to the Grateful Dead.
Now, just so people understand, this is when acid was not illegal, so they could do this.
That's right. Absolutely. Acid is LSD is still completely legal at this particular point. That's what's so strange about the story, and it's interesting when we come to the end. You can see how the illegality coincides with the end of the music era as well. But it really started. I mean, Quicksilver Messenger Service were one of the early bands. I mean, they formed in sort of late '65, and David Friedberg was one of the guys that put them together, the bass player. And if you go to his website, he's got something called David Friedberg's Quicksilver Messenger Service website. On it, he's got Happy 2018 appearances to be announced. But there's nothing announced yet, and nothing seems to have happened in 2018. So we might not get any gigs from him. Though they have been on the road, because I'm pretty sure in 2017 they were on the road.
Well, if you're in acid, time travel happens, so maybe he's got his time wrong and he hasn't jumped back to 2018 yet.
Absolutely. I mean, it would fit in nicely with time travel. I mean, who knows? There might well be time travelers amongst us.
88 miles per hour!
With Velvet Underground, most of this is happening on the West Coast, over on the East Coast. Not really considered as a psychedelic band, but if you look at they did their first gig with Nico at the beginning of '66. Now, they were part of Andy Warhol's multimedia experience. He called that the exploding plastic inevitable. Their music isn't usually considered in the sort of psychedelic frame, but if you look at the concept and the whole experience of the shows at that time, it is 100% psychedelic, because they came together in 65. The Electric Prunes sort of changed their name in early 66. They started out as the Sanctions in about a year earlier, early 65. And before becoming the Electric Prunes, they called themselves Jim and the Lords. Now, if you remember, 1965 is when the British invasion's absolutely at its peak, and American bands were giving themselves British-sounding names. The Byrds called themselves the Beefeaters before finding success as the Byrds. And they had a go at being Jim and the Lords. It didn't help them. Their first single was in May of 66, Ain't It Hard, but didn't find any success.
What were they talking about when they said Ain't It Hard?
Well, so many good thoughts could come out of that. But another band around the same sort of time, mid-66, was a band called Three Sixpence, and that's another British invasion reference, because one of the reasons that they call themselves that is, I mean, 3 and sixpence, before we decimalised, and the currency was based on, 100 pennies to £1, in the same way, 100 cents to $1. The British currency had 12 pennies to a shilling and 20 shillings to a pound. So in terms of converting money, you need to have a pretty good grasp of maths, with one base at 12 and one base at 20. So 3 and 6 would be about a sixth of a pound. So I guess that would be about 20 cents or something. It was half the price of a single at the time, I seem to remember. A single was about 6 and 4. But they released a track called Long Day's Care. And the B-side was Can't Explain, which was a cover of a love track on the Love's first album. And they actually, Three Sixpence, actually morphed into Strawberry Alarm Clock. And Ed King actually joined them. Later he joined Lynyrd Skynyrd. He joined them while they were still Three Sixpence.
So it's not the song Can't Explain by The Who. It's a different Can't Explain. Okay.
That's right. That's why I just mentioned that. Because when you first look at that, you think, wow, they're covering The Who here. But when you check it out, it's actually an Arthur Lee song. And I think it's on Love's first album. But Strawberry Alarm Clock, you couldn't really say they're on tour. But they have one gig in the calendar for the 17th of November in Los Angeles at the Whiskey A Go-Go.
The famous Whiskey A Go-Go.
Oh, absolutely. So, if you happen to be listening in Los Angeles or in Los Angeles on the 17th, that would be an excellent way to spend the evening, I think.
So everybody listening to us on Radio Love out there in Los Angeles, there you go. Something to do on November 17th.
Oh, something to look forward to, I would think.
I got to pub my radio stations. I can't help it, Derek.
No, it's always good to let people know when they can see things, I think. But one of the first all-out psychedelic bands was the 13th Floor Elevators. They found themselves really it was one of the very early, if not the first press reference to somebody being psychedelic. And they played a gig in the New Orleans Club in Austin at the beginning of '66. And the Austin Statesman reviewed it. And that headline that said, "Unique elevators shine with psychedelic rock." And their first album, released in the October of '66, that was called The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. I mean, they really were going for it in a big way.
And the name itself is very unique, because most buildings don't have that 13th floor.
Absolutely.
So they were hitting that psychedelic, other dimensional type thing right in their name. That's great.
Oh, absolutely. The stuff of horror movies. But in the summer of '66, we nearly found Janis Joplin as the lead singer. The band offered her the role, but she decided, because they're a Texas band, she decided she'd move to San Francisco, and that's when she joined Big Brother. There is a tour here. The guiding light in the 13th floor elevators was Rocky Erickson, a real character. We'll sort of come back to stories about him later. But he's actually on tour, again short. He's in America and pops over to Canada for a gig in early November, 2nd to the 10th of November. So, very, very shortly. And he would be well worth catching. I mean, he's one of the real guys behind the whole psychedelic thing of the 60s.
Right, you could call him one of the founding fathers of it.
Oh, I think that wouldn't be an overstatement whatsoever. I think that would be a very good description for him. And British psychedelia also starting on the horizon now in the sort of spring of 1966. The Marquee Club, which is a very famous club in London, they'd started a thing called the Spontaneous Underground. And Pink Floyd, it was a regular Sunday night thing, and Pink Floyd played there for the first time on the 13th of March. Now, Pink Floyd's interesting on the touring thing, because I mentioned the fact that Roger Waters is out and about with his Us and Them tour, and he's at Uruguay, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Costa Rica and Mexico from the 3rd of November to the 9th of December. But Nick Mason, the drummer, he's also put some dates in the diary, and he's doing a thing called Nick Mason's Saucerful of Secrets, and he's got some gigs outlined for the 29th of April to the 4th of May 2019. But he's already played some gigs that were sold out immediately at very small venues in the UK. I think he was at Dingwall's, a club in London, and the Half Moon Pub, which again, that both venues go back a long way. So you're going to be seeing Nick Mason in some very intimate concert halls.
And it's not an understatement to say Pink Floyd is the band that came out of the psychedelic era and really succeeded compared to all the other bands. They were the big band that came out of that era.
Absolutely. I mean, interesting you should say that, because the Incredible String Band, a sort of British psychedelic folk band, their first album arrived in mid-66, but they never achieved anything like the success of the Floyd.
Now sit your butt down.
The John Lebang Show will be right back.
And I promise you'll love it. Yes?
I'd like to take a quick second here to tell you about our new sponsor, Quality One Painting. For interior and exterior painting needs, call Tom at Quality One, 313-982-2986. Tom will give you free estimates, senior discounts, and I can tell you from meeting the gentleman, he's one of the nicest guys on the face of the planet. So for a quality paint job with a professional attitude, call Tom at Quality One Painting. That's 313-982-2986. 313-982-2986. Quality One Painting.
Hey, man, it's at the bottom of the hour, man. Do you know where your kids are, man?
If you want to contact the John Lebang Show, feel free to send an email to jlebang@live.com. And if you're on Twitter, look him up at John Lebang. And don't forget to go to his Facebook page at The John Lebang Show. Now here's John.
But by the middle of 66, you've got mainstream bands starting to experiment with psychedelia. The Byrds' third album, Fifth Dimension, that's got the track called 8 Miles High on it, and that's sometimes referred to as the first psychedelic record.
Interesting.
And if you're a Byrds fan, it's a great time to be checking out the listings, because Roger McGuinn, Richard Hillman and David Crosby are all on tour. Roger McGuinn's, and they're all touring just America. Both Roger McGuinn's and Richard Hillman's tour starts on the 9th of November. Roger McGuinn's goes on to the 16th of March, and Richard Hillman's finishes before Christmas on the 19th of December. And David Crosby, he starts a little earlier on the 2nd of November and finishes on the 8th of December.
So plenty of opportunities to see them. Now the Beatles got in on this whole psychedelics thing as well.
That's right. I mean, this is around the same time. We're still in the summer of '66, and that's when they released Revolver, and that includes Tomorrow Never Knows, which always crops up in any listing of the best psychedelic.
Great song.
Oh, absolutely. And Paul McCartney's on tour. I mean, all over the place: Japan, France, Denmark, Poland, Austria, UK, and America. From now basically through to the middle of June, 26th of June, my birthday, 26th of June next year. So plenty of chance to see more Paul McCartney.
Well, early happy birthday, sir.
Why, thank you very much.
Just as we stay on the Beatles for just a minute, you could say they employed psychedelic methods in just about every one of their last albums after Revolver, there was little bits of the psychedelic stuff in some of their music.
Absolutely.
Like Number 9. In a way, that's very psychedelic.
Yeah, I mean that would well fall into the category. I mean, even though the genre pretty much burnt out by you get to sort of 68, 69, though there's still some good stuff coming out, but it was certainly on the wane. I mean, bands who were long term, who survived the era, as it were. As you said with the Pink Floyd, I mean, you can find elements of the music carrying on very much into the later albums, and it was really starting to come of age in the UK. And that's when the whole counterculture thing reached the UK. We had a thing called International Times, and there was a gig at the Roundhouse to launch it, basically. And it was the first UK counterculture newspaper magazine, founded by a guy called John Hoppy Hopkins, who crops up from time to time.
Hoppy was a hippie.
Yeah. Oh, he he was a big player. What the big psychedelic club was founded by him as well. And the first issue of Rolling Stone was about a year later, actually. It came out in November 67.
So, a lot of this was all happening at the same time, just popping in. That's why we got Rolling Stone magazine, or at least partially why, because they're starting at the time. Because music was huge and they covered music as well as other things, but they covered it as well. Absolutely, yeah. And it was a real change from the straight music papers when you got these, because they got very much into the politics and the background and the hippie culture and all kinds of things. We had Oz magazine in the UK as well, came from Australia, and that was a great magazine. And it's really kicking off now. The Pink Floyd did their first really underground experience performance. So now you've got Psychedelic Effects and Mixed Media, and that was in the October. And again, quick mention of Nick and Roger, busy on tour. And I'd just say, giving just out dates here, if you go to the website, www.rockandroll.com, rockandrollandravelled.com, the actual links to the mostly the official websites of the band, so their tour pages, and that gives all the details of exactly where they are on what dates. Right. If you can't keep up with all the information here, you can go to Derek's website, and it's there, including the tour information.
That's right. What I like to do is do what is essentially a blog of the show, because it is just details and information that's coming out from beginning to end, really. The Electric Prunes now, the end of '66, they had I Had Too Much to Dream last night, one of my favourite singles, and that gave them a hit on both sides of the Atlantic, US 11 and 49 in the UK. They only ever had one more hit, another great song, Get Me to the World on Time in '67. That didn't fare quite so well, 27 in America and 42 in the UK.
27 in is still not shady. That's a good number to be at.
Oh, that's moving a lot of singles. But I did like the Electric Prunes. They were a fabulous band. But one of the key things in the UK was just before Christmas in 1966, a club called the UFO opened in Tottenham Court Road in London, and that was Hoppy Hopkins mentioned earlier, and Joe Boyd, who did he produced the early Floyd stuff. He got very involved in. He didn't actually produce the early Floyd. He was involved with the Floyd, and he produced a lot of other stuff as well.
And that's like the first psychedelic club.
That's very much considered to be the first psychedelic and dedicated psychedelic club in London. We're now into the Summer of Love. The 14th of January 67, you had this big event in San Francisco, sort of Golden Gate Park, and it was billed, I love this, it was billed as the powwow, a gathering of the tribe's human being. And this was really when Haight-Ashbury was becoming the centre of the hippie universe. And the event was inspired by, this is when it starts turning down, as it were, for acid, LSD. Because California, I think, was the first state to actually banned the substance in the October of '66, and this event was to mourn that, basically. I mean, you couldn't really oppose it. It was legislation, come and gone. But what it did, it brought together the beat generation and the hippie culture. And that's what I meant earlier. I mean, you had people like Allen Ginsberg, the beat poet, he was there, LSD guru, Timothy Leary, and Jerry Rubin, who was a major figure in the Vietnam anti-war movements. Jerry Rubin was there as well, and there was music from the Grateful Dead, Quicksilver Messenger Service, and Jefferson Airplane. So it really was a coming together of those two 50s and 60s cultures.
And that took place in Golden Gate Park.
That's right. Yeah, 14th of January. It sort of heralds in the summer of love, basically. And Jefferson Airplane released their second album, Surrealistic Pillow, but that's the one with White Rabbit on. That was early '67. And Jefferson Airplane and Electric Tuner, who we've mentioned once or twice before, because they're always on the road. So every time they crop up, they're almost certainly going to be giving opportunities to see them. Jefferson Airplane in America, 2nd of November to 30th of March. And Electric Tuner. Now, Electric Tuner seem to do two different sets. They do an electric hot tuner and they do an acoustic hot tuner. So the dates of 10th of November to 26th of January, they vary between those two lineups. And they do have some dates in Mexico as well. And then for some reason, they've actually already put the date of the 8th of September 2019 into the diary.
No, they're planning ahead. That's good.
Oh, absolutely. Now, one of the bands that almost nobody will have heard of on either side of the pond is a band called The Smoke. And in February '67, they released a single called My Friend Jack. And it's a great single. I mention it simply because the sort of strapline is, My Friend Jack like sugar lumps. It's a great song. It starts off with some really fuzzy guitar work, and it is well worth a listen to on either Spotify or the equivalents, or just tracking down on the internet. It's a great song. And it was the same sort of time now. What's happening now is psychedelia is starting to hit the charts. It's starting to become commercially successful. And Pink Floyd released their first single, Arnold Lane, in '67. It was produced by Joe Boyd. I don't know why I had a crisis of conscience earlier. It was Joe Boyd that produced it. And that was written by Syd Barrett. And of course, Nick and Roger are on tour. And Jimi Hendrix released Purple Haze around the same time, March '67. I mean, what a fabulous single that was.
In fact, that's what got me into Jimi Hendrix. My mother had the record, I think it was Are You Experienced? Maybe, is that the one with that song on it?
Yeah, the American version track listing has that single included.
And
it wasn't on an album in the UK.
What a way to break in somebody to one of the greatest American guitar players of all time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now we're moving on to April 1967.
Yeah, back in the UK again, with what was called the 14-hour Technicolor Dream. I mean, it was an infamous British freakouts. They were called freakouts and happenings and all kinds of good things at the time. This is in Alexandra Palace in London. About 10,000 people are reckoned to be there. And what it was, International Times, the counterculture newspaper, was facing some prosecution in the UK because they kept saying things against the establishment. The establishment didn't need that. So they needed some money to defend themselves. And what's great, a flyer at the time described the gig as London's own hip newspaper, the International Times, presents Giant Benefit 14-hour Technicolor Dream, 30 top groups, kaleidoscopic colour, beautiful people, followed by a free be-in on Sunday. Tickets £1. I love it. Freak out.
Tickets were only £1?
£1, yeah. Oh, and I mean, if you look at it was a sort of two-stage job, and light shows, music, poetry. And I'd have people like Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett, Crazy World of Arthur Brown, The Move, Alexis Korner, Graham Bond. Yoko Ono was there.
Now, the Pretty Things and Soft Machine were there as well, right?
Absolutely, and John's Children, and Mark Bolan, T-Rex. He was actually part of John's Children at that time, and a band called The Creation. They're well worth hunting down. Forget the guitarist's name, but he's written to be the first guy to use a violin-style bow on a guitar. That's sometimes credited to Jimmy Page, but the Creation guy was doing it before that. And apparently Pink Floyd delivered their set as dawn broke, so that would be pretty awesome.
I'll tell you what, playing a bow on a guitar is so difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm not playing the guitar. I have no appreciation of the competence and technical difficulty of it, but I can imagine that it's not the easiest thing in the world. But what a fabulous sound it creates.
Definitely. And a whole bunch of these people are touring or having shows.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's great to see that. This is from 29th of April 67. Again, mentioned Pink Floyd, so Nick Mason, Roger Waters are out and about. But Arthur Brown's on tour in the UK and Germany, 4th to the 18th of November. These are mostly very short, so you need to get your skates on, as it were, for this. Roy Wood, who is on tour again. He's got a new creation that's billed as the Roy Wood Rock and Roll Band, and that would be well worth seeing. That's just in the UK, 1st of November to 20th of December. But the Pretty Things are on tour. Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Spain, Portugal, and the UK. 1st of November to the 13th of December. Now, that 13th of December gig's at the O2 Arena in London, and it's billed as the Pretty Things' last ever show. So that's quite a sad
And they're going to have special guests, David Gilmour and Van Morrison.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that will be a night to remember. I mean, there'll be all kinds of people in the audience there. If you're sort of star spotting, there will be an awful lot of people there. It'll be, that would be an awesome gig. I mean, these guys came out of the very early 60s British R&B boom. I can't remember the time of their first single, but it's going to probably be about 1963, I would think. Absolutely incredible.
Smoke 'em if you got 'em.
Because the John Lebang Show will be right back.
After this.
That's guaranteed. Yes.
Pane in the Glass, commercial and residential window cleaning for a beautiful sparkling shine that's crystal clear. Call Pane in the Glass Window Cleaning. You can find them on Facebook at Pane in the Glass.
Hey man, you're listening to the John Lebang Show, man.
That's good, because that means you ain't stupid.
By mid-67, Traffic had released Paper Sun, a classic piece of British music there. And Steve Winwood's on tour. Catch him in Ireland and the UK 20th to the 28th of February. So, just a week of gigs there, but he'd be great to see.
Now, not many people would associate, Steve Winwood with psychedelic music, but he goes way back to May 67 with Traffic.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you listen to their early albums, I think it's the first album, absolutely awesome music. But one of the British psychedelic bands that was very popular, didn't sell a lot of records, but they were a fabulous band. They were a band called Tomorrow, and they released a track called My White Bicycle. A lot of people might recognize it from Nazareth. I think Nazareth covered it. And they had a couple of guys in there, a guy called Steve Howe, who actually went on to join Yes, and Twink, the drummer, he joined Pretty Things in time for the 1968 album SF Sorrow. With the Strawberry Alarm Clock is really sort of starting to happen for them now, really. In the April of 67, as 3 Sixpence, they released Birdman of Alcatraz, which I think is a great name, with the B-side Incense and Peppermints, and that was their 5th single on the All-American label. But about a month later, they changed their name to the Strawberry Alarm Clock, and they released the same song, but because people had picked up on the B-sides, Incense and Peppermints, they flipped it, and the Birdman of Alcatraz became the B-side, and it gave them a #1 American hit single.
And all that did was take a name change to do that and flipping it over. That's pretty good.
Absolutely. Oh, and they moved as well to United Artists. No, so not United Artists, Uni, which is a much bigger label, so they're probably getting more promotion. But they were never very successful. They had no UK hits at all, and they just had one more American hit with Tomorrow, in 68. It got to 23.
So now we got the Beatles.
Well, now, yeah, we come to the Beatles' most famous album, released on the 1st of June 67 in the UK and 2nd of June 67 in America. It was their 9th UK album, their 12th Capitol American album. And, of course, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And that's got a bunch of psychedelic, well-deserved songs on it. And there was a big call in the UK to legalise marijuana and legalise pot ad in the Times newspaper, which is a major national newspaper in the UK. It was one of the highbrow newspapers, particularly in the 1960s. And that was actually funded by the Beatles. And that was in response to the jailing of John Hopkins. And this is the time, of course, now, summer of 67, when the Pink Floyd released their Piper at the Gates of Dawn album. Absolutely superb. Syd Barrett actually wrote most of it. Interestingly, the album's title is taken from the chapter 7, the title of chapter 7 of Wind in the Willows by Graham Greene, and by Kenneth Graham. And that's apparently one of Syd Barrett's favourite books. And I like the inspirations for some of the other tracks. Chapter 24, for instance, was apparently inspired by the 5,000-year-old Chinese tome I Ching, the Book of Changes. I mean, Barrett was credited with the design of the rear cover. And it was produced by Norman Smith. Now, Norman Smith's the guy that engineered all of the Beatles' singles and albums, right from the first British release, Love Me Do, right up to and including Rubber Soul. And he was a really interesting guy, as well as being a producer and an engineer. He called himself Hurricane Smith for a while, and he had a chart success on both sides of the Atlantic in 1972 with Oh Babe, What Would You Say? But Tyrannosaurus Rex, this is Mark Bolan and a guy called Steve Berggren Took. He's starting out now. They made their live debut in the summer of 67 at a club called Middle Earth. They were interesting because they were a psychedelic folk duo, and they didn't have an awful lot of success. I mean, Mark Bolan's one of these guys that was beavering away right through the 60s before he found real success in the early 70s with glam rock. But by the time we get to the latter part of 67, funnily enough, it's really the beginning of the end for psychedelic music. UFO closed its doors on the 6th of October, 67. And there was the death of Hippie March in San Francisco.
On the same day.
On the same day. I think that's awesome. I mean, that is country. I mean, the residents of Haight-Ashbury, which was, the hippie centre of the universe, they organised the march. And what it was, the march was a mock funeral. They had carried a coffin. And what they were doing, they were mourning the loss of the high ideals that the hippies had. And they consider that what had happened, as we can see by the chart success that's started to happen with psychedelic music and more bands coming into it or exploiting the opportunities that psychedelia presented. And they thought that, the whole hippie ethos had been killed off by overexposure and rampant commercialism by a bunch of hip capitalists.
So they basically thought it was taken over by people that just wanted to make a movement out of it to sell things for make money. Absolutely. And that was the famous death of Hippie March. And it's interesting to note that was as early as October 1967. I mean, Zappa had his parody around this sort of time as well with We're Only In It For The Money, where it's double sleeve and the inside is a parody of the Sgt. Pepper group photograph. There's still some great music coming, and it carries on for a while yet. Love Release Forever Changes. Now, that was their third album. I think the drummer had moved on by then, but it was still more or less the early-ish lineup. But Mojo magazine actually put that as the second best psychedelic album ever. So, a well-rated psychedelic album. And I thought I'd check out what they thought the other
good albums were. And their top 5, they had Electric Ladyland, that hasn't been released yet, another year or so for that. Hendrix, Love Forever Changes. Pink Floyd, Piper, that's 3. 13th Floor Elevators, Psychedelic Sounds. And the 5th, they had Sgt. Pepper.
And you're saying Electric Ladyland was number 1?
Electric Ladyland, yeah. Mojo Magazine put it as what they consider to be the best psychedelic album ever.
That's interesting.
And what's even more sort of interesting in a sense is it wasn't released, certainly I think it was in the UK, it was released in November 68. I would imagine it was released on both sides of the Atlantic about that sort of time, end of 68. So it's still a way to go, and it's outside of what is really the classic era of psychedelia. But then, I mean, November 67, you've got Disraeli Gears from Cream, their second album with things like Sunshine of Your Love. I mean, a fabulous album.
And then Traffic did Mr. Fantasy album.
That's right. I mean, that is an awesome album. That's at the end of 1967. And that's an interesting one. If you look at the American release and the British release, the American, when it was released in America, it wasn't called Mr. Fantasy. It was called Mr. Fantasy in the UK. In America, it was called Heaven is in Your Mind. And what they've done there, they actually changed the lineup, the listing, and they included some of Traffic singles in there.
Is there a reason for the change? American audiences or something to that nature?
Yeah, well, very much so. In America, there were 2 key differences, I think, at the time, and you see it very much in the Beatles albums. There were fewer tracks on American albums, tend to be 11 or so, and in the UK tend to be 12 or so. But American record releases like to put singles onto the albums. So if you look at the American album releases, if you look at the Beatles' American album releases, you'll find a lot of the American ones have singles on. The British releases, very few have singles on, and that was one of the real differences.
That doesn't seem to be so in today's world. It seems like the album is the same wherever it is now.
Oh, I think so, yeah. I'm not sure how many people now buy an album as such, and rather than constructing their own album by buying individual tracks.
Yeah, it's funny how the music world has kind of gone back to the roots of rock and roll in the fact that singles were huge when it first started, and then we did the album thing for many years, and now it's come full circle where singles are really the way to go for bands.
Oh, absolutely. It's very much one-offs now rather than whole albums. So the chances of another Tommy concept album is pretty slim, I think.
So now we're moving up to the Rolling Stones, eh?
That's right. I mean, at the end of 67, in December, they released their Satanic Majesty's Request. And that really was psychedelic stuff. But it was the first Stones album to get a very mixed reception from the press and from the public. A lot of people really didn't like the album. I mean, it's interesting because in the June of '67, the Beatles released their most famous and successful and highly rated album. But for the Stones, it didn't quite work out.
I think the title might have scared some people off a little bit on that.
Yeah, it could have been. The cover was brilliant, though, because with it being psychedelic, what they did I'm not sure if they did it on the American release, but on the British release, there was a panel about 5 inches square. So that's about 10 centimeters, 12 centimeters square, and it was in 3D. So if you held the album in front of you and moved it from side to side, the head seemed to move on the Stones, and they were pictured in a seating position. It was a great album.
Man, a lot of fascinating information this month, Derek. Why don't you give everybody your social media?
Oh, that would be fabulous. Well, the website itself is www.rockandrollunraveled.com. One thing I will just say there is I had a catastrophic website failure. I lost all the data.
Oh, no.
Well, luckily I've been backing it up myself, so I'm in the process now of putting all that data back on.
You blew up the web, dude. You blew up the web because you had so much information on your site.
Twitter, at RNR Unraveled, Facebook, at rock and roll unravel.
Derek, I thank you so much for joining me again this month. There's so much fascinating information. I mean, you're just a plethora of information that not many people have this kind of background knowledge on the history of rock and roll and all the genres that split off from it. Derek, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you again next month, all right?
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, John. Cheers, mate.
Cheers.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.